Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is the fourth in a series of 5 reviews that I'm doing on the Super Mario series. If you've never watched these videos before, I recommend starting with my Mario 64 video instead, or at the very least watching the Galaxy 1 video first. Since this game is broadly similar to the previous one, I won't be covering it all from scratch. Instead, I'll be focusing on the small differences and additions this time around. It's recommended you play these games before watching these videos if possible. Super Mario Galaxy 2 released in 2010 for the Nintendo Wii. Although the Mario games all build off and influence each other in various ways, Galaxy 2 was the first direct sequel to a main Mario game in a long time. Although it has a 2 on the end of the title, the story seems to start off with a complete reset, which paints the events more as a reimagining of the original Galaxy rather than a continuation of it. Given the way the original ended, they may have felt their only option was to start over, but it also provides an excuse for explaining elements like the spin move as though they're brand new, in case the player never touched the original Galaxy. Despite the need to reintroduce everything, Galaxy 2 gets started much faster than its predecessor, which makes it the first time a 3D Mario has had a shorter introduction than the preceding one. There's a lot of little changes that make the Galaxy games distinct from one another, but perhaps the most interesting one is the way they handle tutorials. This time around there's less mandatory handholding but much more voluntary handholding. Struggling players can resort to the TV screens which show off certain hints and techniques. I don't have access to any kind of playtesting data, but I can't imagine these video tutorials are particularly effective at training people how to play. Since games are interactive, the ideal way to teach the player something isn't to show them, it's to make them do it. Such techniques have been used in just about every Mario game, and Galaxy 2 is no exception. A good example this time around are the planetoids the player uses when they battle Bowser. This technique is actually learned much earlier in the stage when the player uses a planetoid to break a lock on a door. Later in the same level they have to break 3 locks, which requires them to aim their shots carefully. Through clever design, the player builds up the skill set they need for the boss. As such, the need for these TV screens should be quite minimal, but I suppose since they're optional it's a harmless concession to make for the sake of accessibility. The Japanese and European versions even went one step further and included a hilariously patronising DVD which covers even more simple concepts.
Press the A button on the Wii Remote to jump. Press the button while standing still and Mario will jump straight up. Hold the button longer for a higher jump. Press the button while running to jump in that direction. You can use this to jump on enemies and over pits.
I'm not sure this thing was worth the plastic it was printed on, but at least it doesn't get in the way of playing the game. A more contentious inclusion is the Cosmic Guide mode, which takes over and completes the level should the player decide to use it. On the positive side, these are actually even less intrusive than the TV screen, since the player has to die a bunch of times before the option even presents itself. In fact, had I not read the manual or read about the game online, I wouldn't even know it exists, since I never encountered it during normal play. That said, I have encountered similar things in other games, and being offered an easy way out due to too many failures can feel like an aggravating slap in the face. There's also a sense of resentment that some players are getting stars and advancing through the game even though they may not have earned it as much as others. Personally, I'd never opt to use a system like this, as I think it defeats the purpose of playing in the first place. It's tempting to say this kind of system should be thrown away never to be heard of again, but the other side is worth considering too. There's 2 major arguments for the Cosmic Guide that I'd like to examine, one I agree with and one I don't. First of all, imagine a situation where a player has a disability which impedes their progress through the game. For example, it might hurt for them to shake their wrist too much, which would make certain levels of Galaxy 2 much more challenging than others. If the player gets stuck halfway through the game because they can't shake their way past certain stages, then they'll be locked out from the second half of the game. That second half might contain some of their favourite levels if only they were allowed to play them. At the end of the day, the world map progress system is just an arbitrary lock on content, which maybe shouldn't exist. The next argument puts forward a similar idea but from a different position. Some would say that spending money on a game entitles the player to experience all the content of that game, and thus arbitrary content locks are undesirable. This makes some sense, but I can't help but feel it's a very lazy attitude which would lead to poor game design. To use an analogy, this is kind of like saying that purchasing a book entitles you to understand all the themes, subtext, and complexities of that book. In reality, if a book is well written, it will probably have subtle hints and implications that will go over some readers' heads. New perspectives or insights might reveal themselves to the reader on subsequent readings, so that the person who puts effort in is rewarded with a higher quality story, whereas the lazy reader might only understand it at a more basic level. There's no reason why the same shouldn't be true for games if the designer so wishes. When given an easy choice, a lot of players will just opt for the path of least resistance, which could be very destructive in the long run. If players are never forced to master any game mechanics, then the fear is eventually games will become more and more simplified. I sympathise with people who have genuine problems completing certain parts of games due to circumstances outside their control, but I wish this system wasn't open to abuse by lazy players who would otherwise be able to complete it with a bit of effort. All of this is to say, if I were designing the next Mario game, I wouldn't include the Cosmic Guide. I think accessibility concerns can often be addressed through hardware, or at least through other design techniques, but I'm not really going to criticise this game for it either, since it does have some legitimate uses. This whole situation could have been avoided if Galaxy 2 had stuck to the same unlock structure as before, but instead it uses a world map more in line with the 2D installments of the series. The number of bottlenecks the player has to go through to unlock more stages has hugely increased over Galaxy 1, which already had more than Mario 64. On top of the Bowser stages, which are all mandatory, the first star of most worlds is unskippable as well. This is much more restrictive than the previous games, and while that's not necessarily a bad thing, it doesn't seem like this structure is utilised particularly well. In theory, the more restrictive world map could allow for later stages to inherit challenges from earlier ones, but this is rarely implemented. One example where this is done well is with the Yoshi Star Galaxy, which is mandatory. The first star here requires the player to use Yoshi, so from this point on the level designers can assume that the player is familiar with Yoshi. If we think of it this way, then the first star in every world is the most important one from a design perspective, because it's the only one we can be sure the player has to pick up in order to advance. To really take advantage of this, they should have made sure that the first stage in each world taught the player something new, but unfortunately most of these stars are just traditional platforming challenges. In World 2, the first stage is the Puzzle Plank Galaxy, which is actually one of my favourite stages, but it doesn't require the player to learn any significant new techniques. If they had swapped Puzzle Plank with the nearby Hightail Falls Galaxy, then the rest of the game could have been built with the knowledge that the player was familiar with the red Yoshi power-up. This would mean that level designers could then drop the red pepper into later levels, safe in the knowledge that the player is familiar with it. As for the power-ups themselves, there's a few new inclusions this time around, along with plenty of old ones. If I had to guess one power-up that wouldn't be returning from the original Galaxy, it would definitely have been the Spring, so I was very surprised to see this again. It seems a lot of people hated this one last time around, and I can certainly understand where this comes from, as I used to feel the same way myself. After playing both Galaxy games a couple of times, the Spring doesn't seem so bad to me. Since it's all about bouncing everywhere, the focus is always on platforming when the Spring suit comes into play. Granted, it's a totally different kind of platforming than normal, much more limited and easy to make mistakes with, but it is platforming, which is what Mario games should obviously be about. If the Spring had been missing from Galaxy 2, I wouldn't have cared at all, but I'd certainly say it's a more worthy inclusion than the new Rock Mushroom, which only has one proper platforming section in the entire game. Part of the problem with the Rock suit is the shaking motion required to activate it doesn't match its function, but at least this shows how smartly the motion controls are integrated for most other things. Shaking to make Mario spin feels very natural, since the spin is often utilised to correct an otherwise missed jump. Watch a completely novice player try any remotely complex game and they'll probably move themselves around a little when something unexpected happens. Of course, most people quickly grow out of this habit, but I think we all have a little bit of that in us, which is what the spin jump capitalises on. The Flip Swap Galaxy is particularly devious for this, punishing players for relying on their instincts to save them. It's also easy to see how throwing fireballs, creating clouds, or even using the drill line up with the shaking motion the player is performing. The player is mimicking Mario's actions in miniature, or maybe I should say Mario is mimicking the player. Whatever way you think about it, it just feels right. When it comes to the rock power-up, the side-to-side motion of shaking the Wii Remote is somehow translated into a forward speed burst. There's a disconnect here, which makes it less satisfying than it should be, and it doesn't help that most of what it accomplishes can also be done by the Fire Flower, Invincibility Star, or Red Yoshi Pepper. With so many power-ups in play, some of them were bound to be a little redundant. Cloud Mario is probably the best addition, but its function overlaps quite heavily with the Bee Suit, which itself overlaps somewhat with the Boo Mushroom. They all allow the player to go higher or further than before, and all have a floaty feel to them. Thankfully, the clouds don't interfere with Mario's core skill set, which makes them a much more versatile and interesting tool. This is put to good use during the Green Star challenges, where the player sometimes needs to do several long jumps or backflips while utilising the clouds for footing. This is why I don't think it was wise to bring the Bee Suit back for the newer game. Interestingly, the Cloud Flower is balanced differently to any other Mario power-up before it, which makes it feel quite unique. Most suits either operate on a timer or last as long as the player avoids damage, but the Cloud one is resource based instead. This strikes a nice balance between the unlimited and timed power-ups. It doesn't rush the player or feel restrictive, but it also can't be exploited forever. Of course, the most important power-up of all is Yoshi, who makes a triumphant return here after a disappointing appearance in Sunshine. Mapping Yoshi's tongue to the pointer is a particularly inspired touch, which makes me wonder how they'll ever manage to top it in a post-Wii Remote world. This allows the player to move in one direction, while attacking with Yoshi in another direction, without having to adjust the camera position in the process. It's the kind of gameplay scenario the Wii Remote excels at above other methods, accomplishing something with ease which would have been very awkward to implement on a more traditional controller. I've already talked about how Mario's movement mechanics have been simplified in the Galaxy games, so I won't get into that again, except to point out that this is a large part of the reason why Yoshi fits better in Galaxy 2 than Sunshine. The implementation is quite similar in both games, but in Galaxy 2 it's not a drastic step down from Mario's usual skill set. Relative to Mario, Yoshi is a power-up again rather than a hindrance. He can even swim this time. I also particularly like what they did with the new Yoshi power-ups, which, instead of acting as a straightforward enhancement, simply modify Yoshi's behaviour. This is a good way of differentiating the powers. Since Mario is a different entity to Yoshi, the player isn't given full control over their effects. Thanks to all these power-ups, it's easy to remember Galaxy 2 more for its gimmicky moments than its platforming. But compared to the original, there's a lot more pure platforming sections with instant death pits. The Flip Swap Galaxy, Beat Block Galaxy, Sweet Mystery Galaxy and many other sections conform to this style. None of these stages utilise the gravity swap mechanics the Galaxy games are known for. Instead, they each integrate a small but significant twist of their own. This is probably the largest and most successful change compared to the first game. In the last video, I praised the Space Junk Galaxy for its constantly changing objectives and mechanics. They do a good job of keeping the player engaged, but none of them focus on the jumping mechanics the Mario games are known for. In Galaxy 2, the unique mechanics in each stage are better integrated with the platforming. This leads to a more consistent playstyle, with the gravity swaps becoming just another tool to be used only when appropriate. In some instances, this drastically cuts down on the number of launch stars and other interruptions the player has to endure. Some of these stages are straight up platforming from beginning to end, with no breaks in the middle, something the original Galaxy was sorely lacking. Thanks to these types of stages being more common, the challenge has also increased compared to the previous game. This may also be one of the benefits of the Cosmic Guide mode. With an easy way for players to progress, the level designers can safely push the difficulty further than before. While Galaxy 1 had several planets which felt similar to the level layouts in Mario 64, these are almost entirely absent from Galaxy 2, apart from one obvious exception. The Throwback Galaxy was a weird and interesting choice for inclusion in this game, since it feels quite out of place compared to the other more focused stages. I get the impression some level designer at Nintendo just started putting this together to see if they could, and eventually it got included in the final product. Although it's very novel to walk on the underside of a level from Mario 64, this stage otherwise doesn't really do anything new. Even the boss fight is roughly similar to the one from nearly 15 years earlier. With so few changes to the original layout, it ends up feeling quite tame in comparison to the newer stages, but there's an even better comparison of how the series has evolved over time. To see just how much the Galaxy games focus on platforming, you need only look at the Haunted Mansion levels and compare them to the earlier levels of the same type. In 64 and Sunshine, these often focused on puzzle solving, but the later games just throw the player into platforming scenarios instead. It makes me wonder why these are even visually themed the way they are, other than the need to keep with tradition. This is one of the problems with the Mario games, and some might even say Nintendo in general. Although they're more than capable of thinking outside the box in some ways, their series becomes somewhat rigid, with certain conventions becoming deeply ingrained for seemingly no reason. Being a direct sequel, there are some attempts to fix the problems of Galaxy 1, but they're only a moderate success. The best fix made in this version is the introduction of Comet medals, which accomplish several things. They reward players for exploring the stages more thoroughly and executing more difficult techniques. They give the player a clear indication of how to trigger the appearance of new comets, which also means the comets are now permanent rather than temporary. Even the comet objectives themselves have been improved in most cases, the speedrun challenges being a particularly good example. By starting off on a low amount of time and placing time pickups throughout the environment, this gives the player more to consider as they make their way around. These challenges in the original often had several minutes of time on the clock, but in Galaxy 2 there's a better sense of constant pressure. Similarly, the cosmic clones are used to apply pressure to otherwise simple tasks. Last time around, Cosmic Mario was used for races, but in reality this isn't significantly different than just asking the player to do something under a time constraint. If you put a time limit on a level, then the player will try to complete it as efficiently as possible, turning it into a one-man race. In Galaxy 2, the cosmic clones modify the gameplay in a way no other element does, by forcing the player to carefully consider how they navigate the area. This is especially effective since the team have chosen suitable missions to include these on. The Chomp Work stage is interesting enough the first time through, but with the addition of cosmic clones it becomes downright genius. As well as fixing most of the issues with the comets, there's also been an attempt to address the problem with coins. Instead of asking for star bits, the Lumas within stages now ask for coins instead. On the surface this seems like a good idea, but since routes through the level are mutually exclusive, the player doesn't have an incentive to pick up coins the first time through. When collecting the first star, the player can keep an eye out for a hungry Luma, and if they see one then they know when they re-enter the stage they should collect coins. I have to commend the team for at least recognising that coins need more utility, but the ideal solution should encourage the player to collect coins all the time, not just under certain circumstances. Galaxy 2 clearly benefits from being a sequel, but some other outstanding issues have gone completely unchanged. The camera isn't any better than before, although at least it hasn't gotten any worse. Similarly, the intros and outros to each stage follow the same formula as before, but this ends up becoming a crippling oversight. During regular play, these are less than ideal, but tolerable. When the green stars come into play, they quickly cross the line to intolerable, and stay there for a very long time. I suppose this is as much an issue with the green stars themselves as it is with the structure of the game, but whatever way you choose to frame it, the end result is the same. Since some of the green stars are near the start of the stages, the player can collect them within seconds of commencing gameplay, only to be kicked back out of the stage and left to wait on a lengthy and boring process before they can start on the next star. Let's walk through this step by step from the moment the player completes the stage. In this case we'll be using Luigi for a change. First of all, there's an animation where Luigi grabs the star. Then an animation where he flies back to the spaceship. After this, several menus pop up for star bits and coins. The game also saves itself. The player then needs to stand on the switch to get back to the world map. They then need to select the level, which triggers an animation of Luigi leaving the ship. Once the level menu comes up, an alert plays to let the player know a comet is available, after which they get to select which star they want. The star spins for a moment, and the camera pans over the stage for several seconds, highlighting important areas. There's then an animation where Luigi flies through space and lands on the stage. After a short landing delay, the player resumes gameplay. If this part of the video bored you, just keep in mind we only stepped through this once. To achieve 100% completion, this process needs to be repeated about 240 times. It takes upwards of 45 seconds each time, sometimes a full minute, and none of it is skippable. In other words, if you achieved 100% completion, then you spent roughly 3 hours just navigating the menus, and that's the absolute lowest estimate. Now to be fair, there are two parts of this which are understandable. The first is the autosave, which is an improvement from Galaxy since it no longer wastes time with a prompt. The second is the moment the star spins before the level appears, as this is most likely a load time. After that the level is loaded, so all of the remaining moments can be skipped, but only if you're replaying a star. This is the biggest oversight here. Even though the green star introductions are exactly the same as the other ones, the game still locks you into watching them. If you're clever, you can get around this by selecting the same green star each time, but this can backfire if one of the later stars happens to be on an entirely different path. I want to like these green star challenges since some of them are placed in genuinely clever locations, but the menu system turns them into an absolute chore. Of course, it doesn't help that for every clever or challenging green star there's at least one completely mundane or pointless one. This one in the Cosmic Cove galaxy is particularly insulting. There's no difference between collecting these two stars, it's just asking the player to go through the same stage again for no reason. Others can be a little cheap too, like these ones in the Sandslide galaxy where the camera positioning prevents you from seeing the stars until you've already missed them. It comes across as padding, which is especially bizarre since Galaxy 2 has more stages than any other 3D Mario before it. It really didn't need anything else to extend its length. In theory, I have no issue with the designers dropping some extra collectibles into the stages, but it becomes a problem when the very last stage is locked away behind all these stars. This problem also existed in Galaxy 1, and in some ways it was even worse there. Last time around, this consisted of completing the entire game again as Luigi with no alterations. Personally, I see it as a bigger problem in Galaxy 2, because as a sequel it should have been able to fix such a simple problem, but also because it sets expectations differently. In Galaxy 1, obtaining 120 stars just gives a simple prompt at the end that you can now play as Luigi. Completing the game again gives the player the bonus stage as a secret reward. In Galaxy 2, the map is obviously missing the final stage, and the green stars show up as separate objectives for the player to complete, so there's a sense that the game remains unfinished until all of that stuff is collected. It's a small but significant difference and not the only time that Galaxy 2 fails to live up to its own hype. After finishing Bowser for the first time, the player is allowed to access the Special World, an homage to the special stages in Super Mario World, which contains some of that game's most interesting and challenging levels. Unfortunately, the Special World in Galaxy 2 is made up almost entirely of recycled content. The first stage is a simple one from the first Galaxy, the second is original but a minigame rather than platforming, the third comes from Sunshine, and the next two come from the first Galaxy game, meaning only the very last two are original platforming stages. In theory, a bit of recycled content shouldn't hurt this game, but the Special World sets expectations of something better then fails to meet them. If these stages had just been scattered through the game in each of the other world maps, there would be nothing to complain about, but as it is now, they constitute a bit of a letdown. On a similar note, it's disappointing that the final Bowser battle doesn't change significantly from the previous two. This time around, he ends up getting upstaged by his son, who at least has some interesting contraptions to play around with. Although the Bowser battles have that dramatic galaxy flair to them, there's no good reason to repeat them 3 times without any significant changes. It probably would have made more sense to save Bowser for the final moments this time around. It may not feel as climactic as the previous game, but of course it could have been much worse. Much like the rest of Galaxy 2, the ending follows in the footsteps of its predecessor, for better and worse. In general, it's hard to be as excited about anything in Galaxy 2 as it was for Galaxy 1. It may be full of novel new stages and mechanics of its own, but the overall experience is very similar to last time around. Whether you see this as a problem or not will largely depend on your point of view, but Galaxy 2 started its development as a special edition of Galaxy 1, and it shows. Apparently, after seeing how many new ideas the team had, Miyamoto urged them to spin it off into its own entity rather than a re-release of the first game. You can easily still see it as an expansion pack though. Played back to back, the two games essentially form one really long platformer which gets a bit easier in the middle. I don't blame the team for wanting to revisit the Galaxy concept, but it definitely loses a little something in the process. This game has never left as strong an impression on me as the previous one, but looking back carefully over both titles, it's probably the better of the two. If Galaxy 2 had been released first, this might be more clear. Personally, I may prefer the more open level designs of Mario 64, but Galaxy 2 is very focused in its linearity, and this style of platforming works better with the Galaxy controls anyway. Terribly implemented green stars aside, there's less repetition and an even greater focus on platforming than before. There's as many novelties packed in as last time, and this time around they're woven together with the platforming instead of happening one after the other. While Galaxy was a giant leap away from 64 and Sunshine, Galaxy 2 is more like a few small steps further in that direction. As a result, it's a more focused and polished experience, but not quite a journey into the unknown. In the next video, we'll be donning our catsuits and playing with each other in Super Mario 3D World, so I hope you'll join me then. Thanks for watching.